Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It all started with a text from my dad that read, "We need to talk. Bring your checkbook." I thought it was some weird dad joke setup, but when I walked into their living room, I found out he wasn't joking. He was dead serious about me paying off my stepmom's debts. What's worse? When I refused, he told me, "If you don't step up, you're out of this family." When I got the text from my dad saying, "We need to talk. Bring your checkbook," I assumed it was either a joke or something minor. My dad's always been a proud guy, the kind who refuses help even when he needs it. So I figured this must be serious. Maybe he'd gotten a surprise medical bill or some unexpected home repair. I wasn't thrilled about potentially being asked for money, but he's my dad, and I owed him enough to at least hear him out. I showed up at their house the next evening, expecting some kind of one-on-one conversation over coffee. Instead, I walked into what felt like an intervention. Only I was the target. Claire, my stepmom, was sitting awkwardly on the couch, her hands twisting in her lap. She wouldn't meet my eyes. My dad, on the other hand, sat stiffly in his recliner with this grim, no-nonsense expression I hadn't seen since I was a teenager getting grounded. Something was definitely off. Before I could sit down, my dad jumped straight into it. No small talk, no preamble. "Claire's credit cards are maxed out," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "It's putting a strain on the household, and we need you to pitch in." At first, I didn't even register what he was saying. I blinked at him, trying to process the words. "Wait, what?" I asked, letting out a small, nervous laugh. I glanced at Claire, hoping she'd jump in and clarify that this was some kind of misunderstanding. Instead, she just looked down at her hands like a scolded child. My dad didn't miss a beat. "It's about $30,000, he said matter-of-factly, as if he were asking me to pick up the tab for dinner. $30,000. I nearly choked. "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief. "Why is this my problem? I mean, I'm sorry, but that's insane." My dad's face hardened. "We've seen how much money you're spending on vacations and going out," he said, his tone sharper now. "You've got room in your budget to help family." Claire didn't mean for this to happen. She just got carried away. Carried away. I repeated, still trying to wrap my head around what I was hearing. "Dad, I'm 30 years old. I live on my own. I work hard for everything I have. Why would you think I could, or should, just fork over 30 grand to bail someone else out?" The atmosphere in the room shifted. My dad leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together tightly. "Because family helps family," he said firmly. "I paid for your college. I helped you with your first car. When you needed a place to stay after your breakup, who took you in? It's your turn to give back." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I couldn't believe he was throwing all of that back in my face. Yes, he'd helped me when I needed it, but I'd always made an effort to repay his kindness in other ways, whether it was helping around the house, supporting him emotionally after my mom passed, or just being there when he needed me. And those things he mentioned, that was what parents do. They support their kids. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Dad," I said as evenly as I could, "I appreciate everything you've done for me, but this isn't the same. $30,000 isn't some small favor. I don't even have that kind of money just lying around." Claire finally spoke up then, her voice shaky. "We wouldn't be asking if we didn't really need it," she said softly. "I know this is a lot, but I'm so sorry for putting us in this position. I just didn't realize how bad things had gotten until it was too late." I could feel my frustration boiling over. "So, what's the plan here?" I asked, looking between the two of them. "I pay off the 30 grand. And then what? You keep spending like this, and we end up right back here in another 6 months?" "That's enough," my dad snapped, his voice loud enough to make me flinch. "We'll handle it, but we need your help to get back on our feet. You've got a good job, a stable income. This is nothing to you." That was the final straw. I stood up, feeling my hands tremble with anger. "It's not nothing," I said through gritted teeth. "And it's not my responsibility. I'm sorry, but I can't do this." The room went silent. My dad stared at me like I just told him I was disowning him. Claire looked like she might burst into tears. I waited for my dad to say something. Anything, but all he did was shake his head slowly, his jaw tight with disappointment. "Think about it," he said finally, his voice cold. "Because if you don't step up, I don't know if I can look at you the same way." I walked out of that house feeling more confused and hurt than I'd ever felt in my life. How had this gone so wrong? Why was my dad willing to put our relationship on the line over something so outrageous? As I drove home, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about control, guilt, and a family dynamic I hadn't fully understood until now. And I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to the way things were. After that initial blow-up at their house, I couldn't shake the weight of my dad's words. If you don't step up, I don't know if I can look at you the same way. It echoed in my head on the drive home, during dinner, even when I tried to sleep. I felt caught in this emotional web that I couldn't untangle. How was it fair for him to put me in this position? And yet, the guilt started creeping in anyway. The next day, my dad called me. I stared at my phone for a good 30 seconds before answering, debating whether I even wanted to deal with this. But when I picked up, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight into his pitch. "You know how hard things have been since I retired," he said, his voice slow, trying to reason with me. "It's not like we're asking you to pay for a vacation or something frivolous. This is about keeping the family afloat." I sighed, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Dad, I understand things have been tough, but I don't see how this is my responsibility. Claire's spending habits aren't exactly news, are they? She's been living beyond her means for years." He bristled at that. "She's not perfect," he snapped. "But she didn't mean for this to happen. She just got carried away. You've got no idea how much stress she's been under trying to make ends meet." The way he spoke about Claire was almost protective, like she was some innocent bystander who'd been swept into a financial storm. I knew better. Claire was the kind of person who thought brand names equal status. She loved to host extravagant dinners and decorate their house with high-end furniture, all on a modest budget that couldn't sustain it. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was years of unchecked spending. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm, "I feel for her. I do. But I've worked hard to build my own life. I'm saving for a future, for emergencies, for a home. $30,000 isn't pocket change for me." That's when he shifted tactics. "Do you think it was easy for me to pay for your college? Or your first car? How about that time you needed help after your breakup?" I didn't hesitate, did I? Because family helps family, no questions asked. There it was, the guilt trip delivered with precision. He listed every instance where he'd stepped up for me, whether I'd asked for it or not. And it wasn't like I didn't appreciate those things. I did. But he made it sound like they were investments I was now obligated to repay, not the selfless acts of a parent. "Dad," I said quietly, trying not to sound offensive, "you helped me because you wanted to, not because you expected something in return. That's what family does, right? I can't just bail someone out when they haven't even taken responsibility for what they've done." He sighed, the kind of heavy sigh that makes you feel like you've just kicked a puppy. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't wish things were different? But we don't have time to wait for Claire to figure it all out. We need to fix this now." I glanced at the clock, realizing we'd been going in circles for nearly an hour. Claire hadn't chimed in during the call, but I could hear her faintly in the background, probably pacing or hovering nearby. I could almost picture her wringing her hands, waiting to see if my dad could guilt-trip me into submission. "I need time to think about this," I said finally, my voice firmer now. "It's a lot of money, Dad. I can't just make a decision like this overnight." "Fair enough," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But don't take too long. We're running out of options." After we hung up, I felt a wave of exhaustion hit me. My dad's voice had sounded so desperate, so raw. It was hard not to feel for him, even if I didn't agree with what he was asking. But I also couldn't ignore the mounting anger simmering underneath it all. Why was he treating me like his backup plan? That evening, I decided to call my best friend, Sarah. She was the only person I could think of who would give me an honest opinion without judgment. As soon as I explained the situation, she was livid. "Are you kidding me?" she nearly shouted into the phone. "That's insane. $30,000? For what? So she can rack up more debt in 6 months?" "I know," I said, rubbing my temples. "But he's making it sound like I'm the bad guy if I don't help. He brought up every single thing he's ever done for me, like I owe him for the rest of my life." "Listen to me," Sarah said firmly. "Your dad's guilt-tripping you because he knows it works. He's counting on you feeling too bad to say no. But this isn't on you. It's on them." Her words made sense, but they didn't make me feel any less guilty. "What if I'm wrong, though?" I asked quietly. "What if this really is about keeping their house or something serious? I don't want to be the reason they lose everything." Sarah's voice softened. "You're not responsible for their choices. If it's really that serious, they can figure it out without putting you in financial ruin. You have your own life to think about." I knew she was right, but the guilt lingered anyway. My dad's words played on a loop in my head. Family helps family. But wasn't it also his responsibility to protect me from being dragged into their mess? I decided to buy myself some time. I texted my dad, saying I needed a few days to think everything over. His reply came back instantly. "We don't have days. If you don't help, I don't know what we'll do." The pressure was unbearable. No matter what I decided, it felt like I was going to lose something, money, my peace of mind, or my relationship with my dad. And I wasn't sure how much more I could take. The next few days after that call were some of the most emotionally draining I've ever experienced. My dad, who had always been quick to call or text me about even the smallest things, completely shut me out. At first, I didn't even notice because I was so preoccupied with my own thoughts. But by the second day of radio silence, it hit me. I was officially on the receiving end of the silent treatment. At first, I felt relief. I thought, maybe this is a good thing. I need space to figure out my next move. But the longer the silence stretched, the more it gnawed at me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart jumped, thinking it might be my dad reaching out to apologize or at least try to meet me halfway. Instead, it was Claire. She started with short, apologetic texts. "I'm so sorry about all of this. I never wanted it to come to this point. I hope we can work things out." But when I didn't reply, the messages got longer. Claire poured her heart into paragraphs about how bad she felt and how she'd never meant to drag me into her mess. She even mentioned things like how she admired my independence and how lucky my dad was to have me as his daughter. I could tell she was trying to butter me up, but it just made me angrier. If she was so sorry, why was she letting my dad pin this on me? Why wasn't she the one owning up and figuring out a way to solve her own problems? By the third day, my dad finally broke his silence, but not in the way I'd hoped. He called me late at night, just as I was about to go to bed. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that put me on high alert. "I've been thinking," he started, "and I need you to understand something. If you don't help us, I don't know if I can look at you the same way." It was like a punch to the stomach. I sat up in bed, gripping my phone tightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It means exactly what I said," he replied, his tone colder than I'd ever heard. "Family comes first. Always. And right now, your family needs you. If you can't step up, then you're turning your back on us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my dad, the man who used to tell me he was proud of me no matter what, the man who taught me to stand up for myself. And now he was the one backing me into a corner, using my love for him as a weapon. "Do you even hear yourself right now?" I asked, my voice rising. "You're willing to throw away our relationship because I won't pay for Claire's mistakes? How is that fair?" He sighed heavily, like he was the one being put out. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said. "I'm trying to keep everything together here, and all I'm asking is for you to help me do that. You've got the means to make this right. Why wouldn't you?" "Because it's not my responsibility," I snapped. "You're asking me to sacrifice my future for something I had nothing to do with. Do you even care what this is doing to me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I thought for a brief moment that he might actually see my side of things. But then he said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Just think about it." And then he hung up. After that call, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Was I really being selfish? Was I turning my back on my family, like he said? Or was this just manipulation, plain and simple? I kept replaying his words in my head. Family comes first. It was something he'd drilled into me since I was a kid, but this didn't feel like family. This felt like extortion. The worst part was, I couldn't talk to anyone about it without feeling like a terrible person. If I told people the truth, would they think I was cold-hearted for not helping? Or would they see it for what it was, an unfair demand from a parent who should have known better? I spent hours pacing my apartment, trying to figure out what to do. Every time I thought about giving in, a little voice in my head would scream, "No, this isn't your burden to carry." But every time I thought about saying no, I imagined my dad cutting me out of his life forever. By the time morning came, I was completely drained. I called in sick to work because I couldn't focus on anything except the growing knot in my stomach. My phone buzzed with another text from Claire. "Please don't be mad at your dad. He's just under a lot of pressure. I know he didn't mean to upset you." I wanted to scream. Claire was the one who caused this mess, but she was acting like an innocent bystander. And my dad, instead of holding her accountable, had turned on me instead. I didn't reply to her text. I didn't reply to my dad's last message either. I decided to go completely silent, just like he had. Maybe if I gave them a taste of their own medicine, they'd back off. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The longer this dragged on, the more damage it was doing to my relationship with my dad. And I didn't know if we could come back from it. As the days went on, the silence grew louder. I stopped checking my phone as often because every buzz made my stomach churn. My dad wasn't just giving me the cold shoulder. He was freezing me out entirely. And as much as I hated to admit it, it was working. The guilt was eating me alive, but so was the anger. How could he do this to me? How could he let Claire's mistakes ruin what we had? By the end of the week, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or back away. And the scariest part was I didn't know which decision would hurt more. After nearly a week of agonizing over what to do, I finally caved and called Sarah. She's been my best friend since college, and if anyone could give me perspective on this mess, it was her. I poured out the whole story in a single breathless rant. The text from my dad, the guilt trip, the late-night phone call, and Claire's endless stream of apologetic messages. By the time I finished, I felt drained all over again. There was a long pause on her end, and I thought maybe I'd overwhelmed her. But then she said, her voice steady but laced with anger, "This is emotional blackmail." Hearing someone else say it out loud made me feel a mix of validation and shame. "I mean, I get where he's coming from," I said weakly. "It's a lot of money, and they're probably scared. But still." "No," she cut me off. "You don't get where he's coming from. Your dad is taking advantage of you. Full stop. And Claire? Don't even get me started. She's the one who racked up the debt. But instead of dealing with it like an adult, she's letting your dad guilt-trip you into cleaning up her mess. That's not okay." Her words hit me hard. I knew deep down she was right, but I'd been so caught up in the guilt and the what-ifs that I hadn't allowed myself to fully see it. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "If I say no, I'm scared I'll lose my dad. But if I say yes, I'm going to resent him and Claire for the rest of my life." "Then stand your ground," Sarah said firmly. "Seriously, if it comes to it, I'll go with you. Moral support, backup, whatever you need. But you don't have to deal with this alone." The idea of Sarah coming with me felt like a lifeline. For the first time in days, I felt a small glimmer of courage. "Thanks," I said softly. "I might take you up on that." The next evening, I texted my dad and told him I wanted to talk. He didn't reply right away, but eventually he sent back a curt "Fine. Come by tomorrow after dinner." I wasn't sure what to make of the tone, but I took it as an opportunity to finally lay everything out. I told Sarah about the plan, but in the end, I decided to go alone. I didn't want to escalate things by bringing in an outsider, even though Sarah had offered to stay in the car just in case. She made me promise to call her afterward and reminded me, "You don't owe them anything. Don't let them make you feel like you do." When I arrived at my dad's house, the tension was palpable. Claire was in the kitchen, pretending to fuss with the dishes, while my dad sat in his usual spot in the living room, arms crossed. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked in, but he didn't say a word. "Hey," I said awkwardly, trying to break the ice. "Let's just get to it," he replied flatly. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "Dad, I've been thinking about everything, and I need you to hear me out. I can't do this. It's not my responsibility to fix Claire's mistakes." His expression darkened instantly. "Not your responsibility?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "This is family we're talking about. How can you just turn your back on us?" "I'm not turning my back on anyone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But you're asking me to sacrifice my own future for something I didn't cause. That's not fair, and you know it." His face flushed red with anger. I could see the words building up, ready to explode out of him. But before he could unleash them, something unexpected happened. Claire stepped forward from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she dried them on a dish towel. "Maybe we shouldn't force this on her," she said quietly. Both my dad and I turned to look at her, stunned. She rarely contradicted him, and her voice was shaking so badly I wasn't sure she'd get through the sentence. "It's not fair," she continued, her eyes darting between us. "She didn't cause this, and she shouldn't have to pay for it. I got us into this mess, and I'll figure out a way to get us out." For a second, I thought my dad might actually listen to her. His expression softened just slightly, and he opened his mouth like he was about to agree. But then, just as quickly, the storm rolled back in. "You're the one who got us into this mess," he snapped, his voice booming. "Don't try to play the saint now. Do you have any idea how much stress you've put me under? How much I've had to clean up after you?" Claire flinched like he'd slapped her. "I know," she said softly. "And I'm sorry, but this isn't her fault." The room fell into an awkward, suffocating silence. My dad looked at her like he couldn't believe what she'd just said. And for the first time, I saw something in Claire's expression that I hadn't expected: genuine guilt. I stood there, watching the two of them, feeling both vindicated and heartbroken. As much as I hated what my dad had done, it was clear that he was drowning under the weight of this mess. But that didn't make it right for him to drag me down with him. "I think I should go," I said, finally, breaking the silence. My dad didn't say anything, but his jaw tightened, and he refused to meet my eyes. Claire, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, relief, sadness. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but for the first time, I felt like I'd taken back control of the situation. When I got back to my car, I called Sarah, and the moment I heard her voice, I burst into tears. She let me cry it out, then reminded me again, "You did the right thing. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." I wasn't sure how things with my dad would play out after this, but one thing was clear. I couldn't keep letting their problems become my problems. And maybe, just maybe, Claire's small act of accountability was a sign that things could change, though I wasn't holding my breath. After that tense confrontation at my dad's house, everything went eerily quiet. Days turned into weeks without a single call, text, or guilt-ridden message. At first, I thought the silence might be a sign they were letting it go, that maybe, just maybe, Claire and my dad had realized how unfair their request was. But deep down, I knew better. Sarah kept checking in on me during that time, always ready with some reassuring words or a listening ear. One night, after a particularly long rant about how manipulative the whole situation had been, Sarah said something that gave me pause. "Doesn't it seem weird how desperate your dad is about this? Like more than just we're in over our heads desperate," she asked. "It's almost like there's something else he's not telling you." At first, I brushed it off. "I think it's just the amount of debt," I said. 30 grand is a lot to deal with, especially if they're barely scraping by. But Sarah wasn't convinced. "I don't know," she said. "Something about this doesn't sit right. Claire's overspending doesn't explain why he's coming down on you so hard. What if there's more to the story?" The idea nagged at me for days. My dad wasn't the type to let himself be pushed around, not even by someone he loved. If he was acting this desperate, it had to be about more than just credit card bills. That's when Sarah offered to do some digging. "You know, I'm basically a social media detective," she said with a smirk. "Let me look into it. You'd be surprised how much people let slip online." I hesitated at first. Snooping felt wrong. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed answers, especially if my dad wasn't going to give me the full story. So, I gave Sarah the green light. What she found left me speechless. It started with a few random posts and tags on Claire's old Facebook account, back from when she still used it regularly. There were check-ins at casinos, photos of her smiling with stacks of chips, and even a post about winning big but the slots. Most of it seemed harmless at first, just someone having fun on a night out. But then Sarah found a thread of comments on one of the photos that hinted at something darker. "Better luck next time," one friend had written. "Don't worry, you'll make it back." Another comment said, "You should really think about taking a break. Losing streaks happen to everyone." Sarah dug deeper and found even more hints on some gambling forums. Claire had posted anonymously, but her username was tied to an old email address Sarah managed to track down. The posts painted a clear picture. Claire wasn't just an occasional gambler. She'd had a serious problem for years. She talked about losing thousands in one night, trying to win it back, and the shame of hiding it from her family. The worst part? This wasn't a thing of the past. Sarah found evidence that Claire had been to casinos as recently as a few months ago, right around the time my dad started pressuring me for money. Armed with this new information, I felt a mix of anger and heartbreak. If this was true, it explained so much: why my dad was so frantic, why he was willing to risk our relationship over this, and why Claire had seemed so guilty during our conversations. I decided I needed to confront my dad. When I showed up at their house unannounced, my dad looked surprised, and not in a good way. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone guarded. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Claire wasn't there, which was probably for the best. My dad sat down in his recliner, crossing his arms like he was preparing for a fight. "What now?" he asked. "I know about Claire's gambling," I said bluntly. His face froze for a split second before he tried to recover. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Dad," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know she's been racking up gambling debts for years. The credit cards? That's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "Who told you?" he asked quietly. "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you've been covering for her, and now you're trying to make it my problem." My dad let out a long, defeated sigh. "You don't understand," he said finally. "She's been trying to stop. She really has. But it's not that simple. Once you're in, it's hard to get out." I felt a pang of sympathy, but quickly pushed it aside. "And you thought the solution was to drag me into it? To guilt-trip me into cleaning up her mess, so she doesn't have to face the consequences?" "She's facing them," he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you think it's easy for her to admit she has a problem? She's already in therapy, trying to get help. But we can't fix this overnight, and if we don't pay off those debts, things are going to get worse. You think credit card companies are bad? Try dealing with loan sharks." The mention of loan sharks sent a chill down my spine. Loan sharks? I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded grimly. She borrowed money to try and pay off some of the losses. It spiraled out of control. That's why we need your help. To keep this from getting even worse. Hearing the full extent of the situation should have made me feel more empathetic, but instead, it solidified my decision. This wasn't about helping my family anymore. It was about enabling destructive behavior. I'm sorry, Dad, I said firmly, but I can't do it. Bailing you out won't fix the problem. It'll just kick the can down the road. Claire needs to face the consequences, or this is never going to stop. He looked at me with a mix of anger and desperation. You don't get it, he said. If we don't fix this now, we could lose everything. I do get it, I said softly. And I'm sorry you're in this situation. But I can't save you. You have to save yourselves. For a moment, I thought he might argue. But instead, he just looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I thought you'd understand, he muttered. I do, I said, my voice shaking. But this isn't my responsibility. It never was. As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of closure. I wasn't sure what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let guilt control me anymore. I should have known my refusal wouldn't be the end of it. When I told my dad I couldn't help, I thought the harsh reality of the situation might force him to take a step back, to really think about what he was asking of me. But instead, it only seemed to harden his resolve. A few days after my last visit, I got a text from him. It was brief and to the point. We need to talk. Now. I didn't respond right away. Part of me didn't want to go. Every conversation with him lately had been a guilt-ridden minefield, and I was exhausted. But ignoring him didn't feel right either. Maybe this time, he'd come to his senses. Maybe he wanted to apologize. I clung to that slim hope and texted back, I'll come by after work. When I arrived at his house, the tension in the air was suffocating. Claire was nowhere to be seen, which immediately put me on edge. Usually, she'd at least try to soften the atmosphere, but tonight it was just me and my dad. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The moment I walked in, he said, sit down. We need to settle this once and for all. I stayed standing, crossing my arms defensively. There's nothing to settle, Dad. I already told you I can't help. His face darkened. Can't or won't? Both, I said firmly. It's not my responsibility to fix this, and you know it. That's when he hit me with the words I never thought I'd hear from him. If you walk away from this, you're walking away from this family, he said, his voice cold and deliberate. You'll be on your own? The weight of his threat hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. Are you serious right now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I'm dead serious, he replied, his tone unwavering. Family is supposed to stand by each other, no matter what. If you can't do that, then I don't know what kind of daughter you are. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. You're asking me to bankrupt myself for Claire's mistakes, I said, my voice shaking. And you're willing to throw away our relationship if I say no? Do you even hear yourself? He didn't respond right away, just stared at me with that same stern expression I'd seen so many times as a kid. Back then, it was usually followed by a lecture or a punishment, but now it felt like something much worse, like he was severing a bond one thought could never be broken. This isn't about money, he said finally. It's about loyalty, about family. No, I said, my voice rising. It's about control. You're trying to manipulate me into fixing something that isn't my fault, and when I won't play along, you're threatening to cut me out of your life? That's not loyalty. That's abuse. He flinched at the word, but his expression quickly hardened again. If that's how you feel, he said, his voice cold, then maybe we're better off without each other. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. This was my dad, the man who'd been my rock, who'd always told me that family was everything. And now he was willing to disown me over money? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If that's how you feel, I said, my voice trembling but resolute, then I guess I don't have a choice. I turned and walked toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me hoped he'd call me back, that he'd realize how wrong he was and stop me before it was too late. But the only sound was the door clicking shut behind me. The drive home was a blur. I could barely see through my tears as I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts at once. Was this really happening? Was I losing my dad over something so ridiculous? I thought about all the good memories we'd shared, camping trips, Christmas mornings, the way he'd always been there to cheer me on at school events. How could he throw all of that away over Claire's mistakes? By the time I got home, I was emotionally drained. I collapsed onto my couch, the weight of everything crashing down on me. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd missed something, if there was a way I could have handled it differently. But no matter how many times I went over it, the conclusion was always the same. I hadn't done anything wrong. My dad was the one who'd crossed the line, not me. The days that followed were some of the loneliest I'd ever experienced. I kept waiting for my dad to call, to apologize, to say he didn't mean it. But my phone stayed silent. Sarah was my lifeline during that time. When I told her what had happened, she was furious. "That's not love," she said bluntly. "Love doesn't come with strings attached." Her words stuck with me, but they didn't make the pain any easier to bear. I miss my dad. I miss the way things used to be before all of this. But every time I thought about reaching out to him, I remembered his words. "You'll be on your own." I didn't know if our relationship could ever recover from this. But one thing was clear. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being to please him. Walking out of that house was the hardest thing I'd ever done. But deep down, I knew it was the right decision. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of strength. A reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself means letting go of the people who refuse to respect your boundaries. For weeks after I walked out of my dad's house, there was nothing but silence. At first, I thought maybe he was cooling off, letting himself process everything. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear. He wasn't going to be the one to break the standoff. The silence from him was deafening. My dad, who used to text me silly jokes or call me to ask about my week, was suddenly a ghost in my life. I kept checking my phone, hoping for some sign that he was ready to talk, ready to apologize, or even just acknowledge that I still existed. But there was nothing. Claire, however, was relentless. Her text started the very next day. At first, they were short and apologetic. "I'm so sorry about everything. I know this has been hard on you. Please don't give up on us. We need you." When I didn't respond, the messages got longer and more desperate. She apologized repeatedly, swore she was working on her problems, and begged me to reconsider. She even tried appealing to my sense of family. "Your dad loves you so much. This has been so hard on him. Can we just talk one more time?" It was exhausting. Every time I saw her name pop up on my phone, it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. But I never replied. I didn't trust myself to. I knew if I let her draw me back in, I'd end up right where I started, guilt-ridden, trapped, and resentful. At first, the silence from my dad and the barrage of texts from Claire left me in a constant state of anxiety. But as time went on, something strange started to happen. I felt free. For the first time in years, I wasn't bending over backward to keep my dad happy. I wasn't cleaning up someone else's mess, apologizing for things I hadn't done, or sacrificing my peace of mind to maintain a fragile family dynamic. I started focusing on myself in a way I hadn't before. I threw myself into my work, started taking yoga classes, and even signed up for a cooking course I'd been putting off for years. I began to realize just how much of my energy had been tied up in trying to keep the peace with my dad and Claire. Without that weight dragging me down, I felt like I could finally breathe. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from my Aunt Linda. We weren't particularly close. She lived in another state, and we only saw each other at family gatherings. So when I saw her name on my phone, I was surprised. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, Aunt Linda," I said cautiously. "Hi, sweetheart," she said warmly. "How are you holding up?" The question caught me off guard. Okay," I said slowly. "Why?" She sighed. "Your dad called me," she said. "He told me about what's been going on with Claire and the debt. He's pretty upset." My stomach tightened. "I'm guessing he didn't tell you the whole story," I said. "No," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "He told me his version of it. How you abandoned the family when they needed you. But I know your dad. He has a way of twisting things when he's feeling desperate. So I wanted to hear your side of it." For the next half hour, I laid it all out for her. The guilt trips, the manipulative tactics, the discovery of Claire's gambling problem, and the final threat that had pushed me over the edge. By the time I finished, I was shaking with a mix of anger and relief. "I'm so sorry you've had to deal with this," Aunt Linda said, her voice soft but firm. "Your dad's being ridiculous. You don't owe them anything. He should have never put you in that position." Hearing someone else validate what I'd been feeling for weeks was like a balm on an open wound. "Thank you," I said, my voice cracking. "You're welcome," she said. "And for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Standing up for yourself is never easy, especially when it comes to family. But you can't set yourself on fire to keep other people warm." After we hung up, I sat on my couch, letting her words sink in. For so long, I'd been questioning my decision, wondering if I was being selfish or ungrateful. But Aunt Linda's call reminded me that boundaries weren't a betrayal. They were a necessity. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about my right to live my life without being shackled by someone else's poor choices. Over the next few weeks, I tried to hold on to that sense of clarity. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when I'd see an old family photo or hear a song that reminded me of my dad, and the guilt would come rushing back. I'd wonder if I was being too harsh, if maybe I should have found a way to compromise. But then I'd remember the way he'd looked at me that night, the coldness in his voice when he said, "You'll be on your own." And I'd remind myself that love shouldn't come with conditions. One day, while I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop, my phone buzzed with another text from Claire. I almost ignored it, but something made me open it. "I know you're probably still angry, and I don't blame you," the message read. "But I wanted you to know I'm going to therapy now. I'm trying to get better, for myself and for your dad. I just hope someday you'll forgive us." For the first time, her message didn't make me angry. It didn't make me want to throw my phone across the room or scream into a pillow. Instead, I felt indifferent. I didn't reply. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about moving forward, on my terms, not theirs. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally starting to do just that. Months passed before I heard from my dad again. By that point, I had mostly come to terms with the silence. It wasn't easy. I'd spent countless nights wondering if I'd made the right decision, if I could have handled things differently, or if our relationship would ever recover. But over time, the pain had dulled, replaced by a strange sense of peace. I was learning to live my life without his constant presence. The calls, the texts, the little check-ins that used to be a regular part of my day were now memories. And while a part of me still missed him, I also felt stronger. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. Not for his approval, not to keep the peace, and certainly not to clean up anyone else's mess. Then, out of the blue, my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Can we meet? Just for coffee. Please." I stared at the screen for a long time, my emotions swirling in a chaotic mix of relief, hesitation, and fear. Was this his way of extending an olive branch? Or was it just another attempt to manipulate me? I wasn't sure, but something in me couldn't ignore the message. "Okay," I replied simply. "When and where?" "We met at a small cafe near my apartment, one we used to go to when I was younger." I arrived early, partly out of habit and partly because I wanted a moment to compose myself. As I sipped my coffee, I watched the door, half expecting him not to show. But he did. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, more worn down than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders were hunched, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The confident, larger-than-life man I'd grown up with was gone, replaced by someone who seemed tired. "Hey," he said softly as he approached the table. "Hey," I replied, my voice just as quiet. He sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said over the past few months. Finally, he broke the tension. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. He took a deep breath, like he was gathering his thoughts. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "For everything. For the way I handled things. I let my emotions get the better of me, and I pushed you away when I should have been pulling you closer." I blinked, taken aback by his sudden vulnerability. My dad wasn't one to admit he was wrong, let alone apologize. Hearing him say those words felt surreal. I was desperate, he continued, his hands fidgeting with the coffee cup in front of him. When Claire's debt started piling up, I didn't know what to do. I felt like the walls were closing in, and I panicked. I thought if I could get you to help, we'd have a chance to fix things before they got worse. But I realized now that I put you in an impossible position, and that wasn't fair. I let his words sink in before responding. "You didn't just put me in an impossible position, Dad," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You made me feel like I was the bad guy for saying no, like I wasn't a good daughter, because I couldn't save you from something I had nothing to do with." He winced, and I could see the guilt in his eyes. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm sorry for that. I was wrong to put that on you. You didn't deserve it." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been bracing myself for another fight, another attempt to guilt me into giving in. But this was different. He wasn't trying to manipulate me or make excuses. He was taking responsibility, something I hadn't expected. "I appreciate the apology," I said after a long pause. "But I need you to understand something. My boundaries haven't changed. I'm here for you, Dad, but I can't be the solution to every problem. That's not fair to me, and it's not fair to you either." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I get that, he said. I think I've always known it deep down. I just didn't want to face it. I thought if I pushed hard enough, you'd cave, and everything would be okay again. But that's not how it works. No, it's not, I said gently. And honestly, I think you and Claire need to figure this out together. It's not just about paying off the debt. It's about addressing the root of the problem. Until that happens, nothing's going to change. He looked down at his coffee, his brow furrowed. You're right, he admitted. Claire's been going to therapy, and we've been working through it together. It's not easy, but we're trying. Hearing that gave me a small glimmer of hope. That's good, I said. It's a step in the right direction. We sat in the cafe for a while longer, talking about lighter topics. Work, family, even a few old memories that made us both laugh. It felt normal, like we were finding our way back to each other, one conversation at a time. When we finally said goodbye, he hugged me tightly, holding on a little longer than usual. I'm proud of you, he said as he pulled back, for standing your ground. It couldn't have been easy, but you did what you had to do. And I respect that. Those words stayed with me long after he left. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page, like he truly saw me, not as an extension of his problems, but as my own person. As I walked home, I realized that while our relationship might never go back to what it was, it didn't have to. We were building something new, something stronger, built on honesty and mutual respect. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. In the months following my dad's apology, life slowly began to feel normal again. We were back to where we used to be, but we were talking more regularly, short phone calls here and there, and the occasional lunch. It was a cautious rebuilding, one step at a time. As for Claire, I kept my distance. I wasn't angry anymore, but I also wasn't ready to throw myself back into their orbit. I needed time to protect my own peace, and I didn't trust myself to navigate a relationship with her without reopening old wounds. That's why it was such a surprise when Aunt Linda called me with an update. You'll never guess what Claire's up to, she said, her voice light with something that sounded almost like pride. I braced myself, expecting another plea for help or a new layer of drama. What? I asked hesitantly. She's going to therapy, Aunt Linda said. And not just for appearances either. She's really working on herself. She even joined a support group for gambling addiction. I blinked in surprise, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. Wait, seriously? Seriously, Aunt Linda confirmed. I've seen her at the meetings. She reached out to me a while back, said she needed help finding resources. I've been going with her to some of the sessions to show support, hearing that felt like a mix of relief and disbelief. Claire, the woman who had spent years living in denial, was finally taking responsibility for her actions? It was almost too good to be true. Over the next few weeks, Aunt Linda kept me updated on Claire's progress. She told me about the therapy sessions, the support group meetings, and even the financial counseling Claire had started attending to learn how to manage her money more responsibly. She's a different person, Aunt Linda said during one call. I mean, she's still Claire, still a little dramatic, still loves her fancy coffee, but she's trying. She's admitting her mistakes, and she's taking real steps to fix them. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. On one hand, it was a huge relief to know she was finally addressing the problem. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder why it had taken so long. Why hadn't she made these changes before everything spiraled out of control? Before my dad had tried to drag me into their mess? Part of me wanted to believe my tough love had been the catalyst, that standing my ground and refusing to enable their behavior had forced them to face the truth. But another part of me worried that it was just a coincidence, that my decision hadn't made a difference at all. A few weeks later, my dad brought up Claire during one of our coffee meetups. He'd been hesitant to mention her since our reconciliation, almost like he was testing the waters. But this time he seemed eager to share. Claire's doing better, he said, stirring his coffee absently. She's been going to therapy every week, and she's really sticking to it. That's good, I said carefully, not wanting to sound too eager or dismissive. She's even started paying off some of the debt, he continued. She got a second job just a few hours a week, but it's something. She says she wants to take responsibility for what she's done. Hearing that surprised me even more than the therapy. Claire had always been the type to avoid hard work, especially when it came to fixing her own mistakes. The fact that she was willing to put in extra effort to pay down the debt spoke volumes about her commitment to change. That's impressive, I said finally. My dad nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think she finally gets it, he said, and I think we both learned a lot from what happened. I raised an eyebrow at him. What do you mean? He sighed, leaning back in his chair. I realized how much I've been enabling her over the years, he admitted. I thought I was helping by covering for her, but I was just making things worse. And when things got bad, instead of facing it head on, I put the burden on you. That wasn't fair to anyone, especially not you. His words caught me off guard. For so long, I'd felt like he didn't understand the impact of his actions. But hearing him acknowledge his role in the situation felt like a step toward healing. I'm glad you see that now, I said softly. Me too, he replied. And I'm glad you stood your ground. If you hadn't, well, I don't know if any of this would have happened. A few weeks later, Aunt Linda invited me to one of Claire's support group meetings. She's been talking about you, she said. I think it would mean a lot to her if you came. I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face Claire in that kind of setting. But Aunt Linda's words stuck with me, and after some thought, I decided to go. The meeting was held in a small community center. When I walked in, I saw Claire sitting near the front, her hands folded nervously in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening in surprise. You came, she said softly when I sat down beside her. I did, I replied, offering a small smile. The meeting was emotional, but uplifting. I listened as Claire shared her story, talking openly about her struggles with gambling and the impact it had on her family. She didn't shy away from admitting her mistakes, and for the first time, I saw her in a different light. Not as the source of so much pain, but as someone who was trying to heal. Afterward, she pulled me aside. Thank you for coming, she said, her voice shaky. I know I don't deserve it, but it means a lot. I'm proud of you, I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. It's not easy to face your problems, but you're doing it. That's what matters. Walking out of the community center that night, I felt a strange sense of closure. For so long, I'd been angry at Claire and my dad at the whole situation. But seeing her take responsibility for her actions made it easier to let go of that anger. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about moving forward one step at a time. And for the first time, I felt like we were all heading in the right direction. It's strange how time softens the edges of even the hardest memories. When I think back to everything that happened with my dad and Claire, it still feels raw, but the sting isn't as sharp as it once was. In the months that followed Claire's decision to seek help and my dad's apology, our lives slowly started to take on a new shape. One that wasn't perfect, but one that felt more honest. My relationship with my dad is still a work in progress. We don't talk as often as we used to, and I think that's okay. The space gives us both time to reflect and approach each conversation with a little more care. When we do talk, the tone feels different. It's less about obligations or expectations, and more about genuine connection. One afternoon, during a lunch we'd planned at a quiet diner, he admitted something that caught me off guard. You know, he said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly, I think I expected you to always need me. I thought that's what being a parent meant, always being the one to step in, to fix things. And when you didn't need me in the same way anymore, I guess I didn't know what to do with that. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with years of unspoken feelings. I've always needed you, Dad, I said gently, but not to fix things for me. Sometimes I just needed you to listen, to trust me to figure things out on my own. He nodded slowly, as if the idea was only now starting to make sense. I think I'm finally starting to get that, he said. As for Claire, things remain tentative. We've had a few brief conversations here and there, mostly in group settings with my dad and Aunt Linda. Each time, she's been careful to tread lightly, always acknowledging the boundaries I've set. I can see the effort she's putting in, and while I'm not ready to fully let my guard down, I respect the work she's doing to rebuild her life. Aunt Linda occasionally updates me on Claire's progress, though less often now that I've made it clear I want to keep some distance. According to her, Claire's still going strong with therapy and her support group, and she's made significant progress paying down her debts. Hearing that feels like a small victory, not just for her, but for all of us. Once, during one of our rare conversations, Claire surprised me by thanking me outright. I know I put you through hell, she said, her voice tinged with regret. But if you hadn't stood your ground, I don't think I'd be where I am now. So, thank you for not giving up on yourself, even when I didn't deserve that strength from you. It was a lot to take in, and I didn't have the perfect response. I just nodded and said, I'm glad you're doing better. That's what matters. Looking back, I don't regret saying no. In fact, I think it was one of the hardest but most important decisions I've ever made. Standing my ground against my dad, someone I'd always idolized, felt like I was shattering a part of myself. But what I've come to realize is that the pieces didn't break. They just shifted, realigning into something stronger. Saying no wasn't just about protecting my finances or my future. It was about protecting my sense of self. For so long, I'd equated love with sacrifice, thinking that putting others' needs before my own was the ultimate proof of loyalty. But But this experience taught me that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's a trap. That realization has trickled into other areas of my life, too. I've started setting firmer boundaries with friends, coworkers, and even myself. It's not always easy, and there are moments when the old guilt creeps in, whispering that I should do more, give more, sacrifice more. But then I remember what it felt like to finally say no, to finally choose myself, and it quiets that voice. The other day, I found myself scrolling through old family photos, pictures of me and my dad fishing, playing board games, or just goofing around. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel the ache of loss when I looked at them. Instead, I felt gratitude. Those moments are still a part of who we are, even if things have changed. I know my dad, and I will never go back to the way we were before all of this happened. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. We're building something new, something rooted in mutual respect and understanding. It's not perfect, but it feels real. As I sit here reflecting on everything, one thought keeps coming back to me. I'm proud of myself. I'm proud of the strength it took to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like I was risking everything. I'm proud of the boundaries I set and the way I've held firm to them, even when it would have been easier to cave. And I'm proud of the life I'm building for myself, a life where I'm no longer living in the shadow of someone else's expectations. It's not the ending I imagined, but it's the one I needed. And in the end, that's enough.